All right, everyone. Now we're going to have a little examination of Renaissance art. First thing we'll look at are some themes in Renaissance art, and then a little compare contrast of that with some pieces of medieval art, and then moving on through the early, high, and late Renaissance. One of the things that we should really mention up front here on this is the extent to which, or how important it really is that um, artistic production is really what we most associate with the Renaissance, aside from all the political and social developments and so forth. Some historians, some art historians, commentators like Kenneth Clark, for instance, has argued that the Renaissance really didn't produce many great philosophers, but it created artists who had philosophical and theological points of view that they wished to express. And we will examine that to some extent over the course of this lecture. Some general characteristics of Renaissance art. First of all, we have to recognize of how heavily influenced by Greek and Roman architecture, statuary, and so forth that the Renaissance really fell. Um, it's we just I can't emphasize that enough. And it's very simple to say and hard to just elaborate on that. Particularly when it comes to architecture, Rome tended to be the biggest influence, and because the Romans tended to copy Greek statuary. So we would really say that there's the Greek is the influence on sculpture, the Roman is the influence on the architecture, and certainly we're talking about we're talking about places in Italy. When architecture becomes important, they're just looking around at Roman ruins and seeing what the Romans had done and reinventing that in their own time. In painting, which had certainly become commonplace in over the course of the Middle Ages, fresco in particular, painting on wet plaster. Three new developments emerge. One of them is linear perspective, which gives a sense of depth, or what art historians call recessional space, in a particular painted work. There's old ways of doing that, what's called atmospheric perspective, which isn't very scientific. It just means that as you get into the background of, let's say, a landscape, it'll be more bluish. And we'll see that in a couple of instances here, especially in Northern Renaissance art. But linear perspective is really trying to scientifically and mathematically scale the painting so that it looks like there's depth in it. Objects in the front are much larger than objects in the middle or objects in the sort of background of the canvas or wall painting. Naturalism is another really important aspect of it. The human figure there is an attempt to predict or to depict the human figure as naturalistically as possible, as opposed to some types of abstraction that we see still in the Middle Ages, very elongated bodies, very refined bodies. It's not natural. It's more an abstract depiction of the human form. So naturalism is very important in the Renaissance. Chiaroscuro, shading to create volume in a figure. Instead of a very flat image, very basic, bold colors, now we're going to shade the contours of the drapery that falls around a robed figure that gives greater volume to the human form. Da Vinci's Mona Lisa is a great example of how that kind of shading is used. There is both religious and secular subject matter that we see in Renaissance art. Again, it goes back to the idea that the Renaissance is not anti-religious. However, Northern Renaissance artists do tend to focus a little bit more on religious and landscape subject matter. And of course, I mean, certainly Italians who are in the employ of the church are going to depict a lot of religious themes, but there tends to be a little bit more focus in the North on religious matter. And then finally, we'll look just briefly at a movement called Mannerism, which is to some extent a reaction against the Renaissance style, but still considered sort of a faint echo of it. Like the Renaissance, it's elegant, but it's an overemphasis on the elegance. It tends to be a little less restrained, less classical, less Greek and Roman, and will emerge in the High Renaissance um, as a kind of echo of it, and is really influenced by the artist Titian. Um, that will then lead into the next art historical period, which we'll study later on, which is called the Baroque, which is even less restrained and very dramatic. One of the most important aspects of Renaissance art is patronage. As wealth began to accumulate in the Italian city-states, that wealth is going to be put into the employ of creating great works of art, for improving the city, really kind of civic virtue, civic mindedness on the part of many of these wealthy patrons. But the wealthy patrons who are endowing these works, beautifying these churches, beautifying these public places, are not without their own kind of vanity. So, for instance, we look here at Sandro Botticelli's Adoration of the Magi. We will see that the family that commissioned it, the Medici family of Florence, most important patrons of the arts, Cosimo de' Medici is right here. He is actually the image for one of the elder magi that are depicted there at the feet of the infant Christ. Other members of the family are also depicted in the retinue of the Magi, and we even see Botticelli puts his own image over in here. It's one of the first times we see artists doing that. He's depicting himself in profile, looking slightly out at the viewer in this. So there's a self-portrait of Botticelli in there. Much of what we know about the artists of this time is from a very important work by Giorgio Vasari, The Lives of Artists as it's commonly known, but it's really the lives of the most excellent painters, sculptors, and architects, published in 1550. And a lot of the commentary that we have on men like Michelangelo and Leonardo da Vinci and Donatello and Raphael and the rest really come through Vasari's lives of the artists. To compare and contrast a little bit, sort of where art was, on the right-hand side we have a Canterbury manuscript. This is a medieval work. This is a book plate. And you can see how all of these images are telling biblical stories. A closer inspection of these, we'll see that they're very flat, they're very abstract, there's not much naturalism. The colors are very bold, very powerful. It's very robust. There is sort of this detail scroll work around it. It is really a remarkable example of page illumination. Some of these elements, you notice the striking use of blue in here. That's going to be very influential. Blue is one of the hardest colors to produce. So when Giotto creates his fresco in the Arena Chapel in the early 14th century, we see his use of those blues as well. But here, Giotto is doing something very, very different. Notice how he's starting the use of chiaroscuro, of shading, giving these figures that are in here dimension, giving them volume. We also see that each face has an expression on it, an emotive expression. The body postures are increasingly more naturalistic. And so Giotto is really seen as kind of the grandfather of Renaissance art. He's still considered more or less a medieval artist. He's creating works in that idiom, but he's so highly influential on the works of so many of the later painters of the Renaissance. He really is the man of the hour in creating this great shift in art. In the early Renaissance is dominated by figures in working in the smaller Italian courts and city-states of northern Italy. One of the most important sculptors of this time is Donatello. We see here his bronze David. This is smaller than life size, so it's rather, small statue, cast in bronze. Recreating bronze work like this is not something that died during the Middle Ages, but bronze statuary of this type was relatively uncommon. Again, depicting a biblical theme with sort of the hat here being a wink at contemporary fashion. So one must say that not all Renaissance works will we see all the figures in historic costume. They will depict far off events of ancient history, sometimes in the contemporary dress of the early 15th century. On the right-hand side, we have Masaccio's Holy Trinity. This is an important work of art because here we begin to see that use of recessional space, of perspective. And we notice that's created very dramatically here in the vault of this ceiling, right? This is a fresco. This is flat, but he's giving it dimensionality by having these coffers on this ceiling recede into the background. The vanishing point on this work is the head of Christ. Notice the classical use, the Roman arch here, Roman columns and capitals. Down here at the foot of the cross, these are the patrons of this particular work. But if you look at it and you say, well, that's perspective, but that's really not quite, if you were to look at a vaulted arch, that's not quite how it would look in reality, naturalistically. He's overemphasizing it. But we have to understand that the height of this is so immense that your head would come to right about here if you stood in front of the work. So Masaccio is compensating for the fact that you are looking upward at the canvas, and because of that requires that this recession of the coffering in here be much more dramatic than if it was designed to be viewed face on. Okay, that this section of the canvas was at head height. Now, this is it here, and so if you looked up, that's how it would appear to you. So he does compensate for the fact that it is of its location, what art historians call in situ, the place where it's located determines the work. We have architectural forms that are very important. The two Florentine competitors working in the early Renaissance in Florence at the same time. Both men competed to do the doors of the baptistry of San Giovanni. Lorenzo Ghiberti won that composition, and he created these incredible doors that Michelangelo would eventually come along and deem the gates of paradise, a great compliment to Ghiberti. These doors, there are approximately 8 to 10 bronze panels in each door. This is an example of one panel. And we see how he uses that classical form, the Roman arch. He creates the recessional space by having the vanishing point be identified by these orthogonal lines. These lines of the tiles here lead us back into the canvas. And then he can arrange the figures proportionally throughout this. It's a very complex process to create a bronze. It requires many, many steps, and if you screw up on any one of them, you have to start the process all over again. Brunelleschi, since he did not get the commission to do the baptistry doors, went on to create this incredible work of Renaissance architecture, the dome of the Santa Maria del Fiore, Our Lady of the Flowers in Florence. It's just commonly called the Duomo. They just call it the Dome because that's what everyone knows. It's a kind of late medieval Italianate church with this great Renaissance dome and lantern on top of it. It is, I believe, still considered to be the largest freestanding masonry dome in the world. You could actually fit the dome of the Capitol building in Washington, D.C. inside this one. The previous holder of that title was the dome on the Hagia Sophia in Constantinople. And this was built without any use of interior supports. So all of this is held together. I should say that there's a double dome. There's an interior dome, and this is the outer shell. But this is all held together simply by using gravity, a marvel of engineering. One of the men who spans the period of the early Renaissance and leads us into the High Renaissance is Michelangelo Buonarroti. Two works by him among so many stand out, and time is of the essence, so we have to focus on two works. One is his statuary. He was a mason by trade and was arguably one of the greatest sculptors of the age. This is his David. Again, head height on this would be the base. So we can't see the full base down here, but this is an immensely tall statue. It was actually designed to go on one of the pediments here of the Duomo, and for that reason, if we look at it, we'll notice that there are some things that are out of proportion. For instance, the hands are quite large, the eye sockets are quite large, and that's because it was designed, again, to be viewed high up on the church. And so Michelangelo was compensating for that. It's one of the reasons why the base that it's put on here is so large, to lessen that. But the eye does compensate for those types of irregularities. But there is a naturalism of style here, a tension of the body, a focus, and what, again, Kenneth Clark said, a soul that we do not see in much art of antiquity. So it's really, it is, to me, it is one of the most emblematic works in Western art. And we should compare that to Donatello's much earlier bronze statue of the David to see what things are really motivating Renaissance artists as this time frame goes on. Over here, we have his great ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. The grand narrative, as you walk in, is creation. That goes down the center of the ceiling, with the central panel being the creation of man. And so much can be said that is emblematic of this creation of man. It shows a beautiful divinity, wise, omnipotent, caring, and loving, but a humanity that is as equally beautiful in its created form, that is so classically humanist. Again, not anti-religious, but the focus in this work is here on the human being created by the wise God. And of course, the near touch that we have here. Notice how in this canvas, God strains every muscle of his being to reach towards Adam, and yet Adam reclines in this relaxed pose of not indifference, but in a sense marveling at his own createdness and his own beauty. As Kenneth Clark said, like a river god of old. Two other works from the Sistine Chapel that are of note, and there are many. It's a very complex work. But what are sometimes called the athletes and the seers and sibyls. Michelangelo paints beauty in many ways, and beauty is not always physical beauty, as we see with the so-called ignudi, the nudes, the athletes as they're sometimes called. Humanity in its physical perfection, versus the prophet Ezekiel here, humanity in the beauty of wisdom. That with age and knowledge comes another beauty that is to be as highly valued as the physical beauty of youth. And that's really a critical thing to emphasize, because in our own time, we tend to say, well, this is beautiful and this is a sweet old man. But really, that's what Michelangelo is trying to capture in these other works that flank the main story of the creation. Another important artist working at around the same time that Michelangelo is dealing with the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel is Raphael, who's painting the papal apartments and the papal library. Here we see the School of Athens, as it's called. These are worldly philosophers, secular philosophers here, in this amazing classical styled space, okay, that he depicts. At the center of this are the two great philosophers of antiquity. On this side is Plato, here is Aristotle. Plato gestures upward to the realm of ideas and forms and concepts, and Aristotle gestures outward to physical realities. And one must say that in this, that Platonic idea of perfect forms, of geometry, being the thing that really rules what is aesthetically pleasing, what is beautiful, what is perfect. Notice how geometric this space that Raphael creates is. Notice, to some extent, how much geometry plays a role in all of Renaissance art. If we look at this other work over here by Raphael, again, we see the recessional space created going back to the temple. This is supposed to be the temple in Jerusalem, the Hebrew temple. And notice how, again, geometry plays such a role with these lines creating that sense of recession and how organized the space is. To some extent, one can argue that it's so geometric, that it's so perfect, it actually starts to defy naturalism a little bit, because the world that we know isn't quite as orderly as all that geometry suggests. But that geometric perfection is an artistic representation of that great Platonic revival that happens to give so much energy to the Renaissance. Leonardo da Vinci, who I mentioned in the introduction, is one of the other great artists of the age. Here we have his famous Mona Lisa. She is famous, despite the small size of the actual canvas, for her expression, for the shading, for the volume of the figure. And it really is the figure. The background is almost like one of those pictures that you take in front of a false background, because the background is very secondary to this as opposed to the central figure here. Da Vinci is also very much known for his interest in science and anatomy, all sorts of things, really. Flight, all sorts of things Da Vinci is into. But notice how he does such detailed drawings of anatomy. These were not known until really the middle of the 20th century. But notice the preoccupation with anatomy and then how that translates into depicting the human body. These artists wanted to know how the body worked so that they could depict it most accurately, even if that meant pulling back the layers of skin to see how muscles interact with each other, how the musculature of the body, and how bodies in different poses then would strain and we developed, and so on. Here we have architectural works of the Italian Renaissance. Probably one of the most important early architects was Donato Bramante, who is responsible for designing this little gem called the Tempietto in 1502. A domed, round structure, a baptistry, a small chapel. And then how then, because of this work, he wins the competition to design the new St. Peter's Basilica, which we see over here on the right-hand side, which is probably the greatest work of Renaissance architecture. But St. Peter's is built over a very long period of time, over 120 years. And Bramante's initial architectural design will be altered by Michelangelo being one of them. Michelangelo is the one who's actually responsible for creating this dome. That's his contribution. Bramante's floor plan is more or less left intact. However, Maderno concedes to demand, which is that in a Latin church, in a Catholic church, there's a very long nave, a long aisle that Bramante did not include. He went for a more Greek-style church, a Greek cross church. So Maderno adds a nave and this facade that we see down here at the front. That's his contribution. Bernini, the great sculptor really is associated with Baroque art, we'll see some of his works in the interior of it, as well as the great square that Bernini designs. So this is a collaboration of some of the greatest artists of all time to create this one very important church. Towards the end of the Renaissance, we have the period called the Mannerists. And there's many works of Mannerist art. Titian is probably one of the great leading exponents of it. But here we have Parmigianino's Madonna with a long neck. The Renaissance leads to an emphasis on elegance. And this is supposed to be very, very elegant. And so he over-accentuates the neck on the Madonna. It is not naturalistic, because here again, we have that back and forth between naturalism and abstraction. That's not how the human body works. But in order to create a very elegantly posed body, he extends the neck. He extends the length of the fingers of the Madonna there, of the Virgin Mary. And so therefore this isn't as naturalistic as it ought to be, because there's another agenda, an elegant agenda, behind this particular work. Another work of the late Renaissance is an architectural work by Andrea Palladio. We call this style the Palladian style. And you notice his use of columns of the Greek pediment for temple, with the Ionic columns and the frieze here, the ornamentation on the roof line. There's a small dome on the top. There are Roman arches here. All of this it's actually styled much more like a Roman temple front. A Greek temple would have stairs all the way around the temple area. This has one staircase leading up to the temple. That suggests Roman influence. But Palladio's style will be echoed all the way down through the centuries. It will be heavily influential in the neoclassical style, in the Georgian style, in the Greek revival style, and so on and so forth. So we can see works that are influenced by Palladio, for instance, Thomas Jefferson's home at Monticello, much of the architecture in Washington, D.C., all influenced by this particular work. All right, for now, we're going to take a little pause for this lecture, since we're running kind of long, and we will open up another lecture that will look at mostly art of the Northern Renaissance and some issues regarding the art of royal power and authority. For now, thank you very much for listening.